Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of Chess Down Under. Today we'll be taking a look at a really fascinating, attacking, crazy game that Garry Kasparov played. This game was between Kasparov and Lev Polugaevsky, who was one of the top contenders during that era. Garry has the white pieces and he starts with e4. Lev plays c5, going into the Sicilian Defense. Knight f3, d6, d4, cd, knight d, and knight f6. So we have a fairly typical open Sicilian defense here. Knight c3, e6. So we have a Scheveningen setup here with the black pawns on e6 and d6, which was very popular back then, and it was a setup that Garry Kasparov himself championed quite a bit. And now the question for white is, does he play more modestly with some sort of kingside castling setup, either with the bishop to e2 or potentially a fianchetto setup as well? Or does he look to go queenside and start throwing his pawns up the board? Well, the fact that I chose this game to show to everyone on YouTube means that we got the more exciting version. Garry plays bishop to e3, prioritizing his queenside development, signaling that his king is most likely going to go to the queenside. a6 from black, and this is quite typical. Whenever the white side is signaling that it's most likely going to go to the queenside, we typically see queenside expansion with a pawn storm of black's own on the queenside. And g4 from Garry, so he's not wasting any time. He is throwing his kingside pawns up the board. There's no second guessing now what's happening in this game. White is going to be launching his kingside pawns up the board, looking to create all sorts of chaos there, and black is going to be looking to play down the queen side. Knight to c6 from black, and g5 just pushing straight ahead, attacking the knight on f6 and pushing it back to d7. We have rook to g1 from Garry and bishop to e7 with pressure here. Garry plays h4, reinforcing his pawn. Castles kingside, so very brave from black here, just castling straight into it. He can see that the pawns are storming up the board, but he's not worried about it. He just castles kingside and he thinks that he's got everything under control. Well, let's see how that decision plays out for him. And h5 from Garry. So he's not even prioritizing his development and getting his king out of the center. He's just hurling those pawns up the board as quickly as he possibly can. Knight to e5 from black. So he's looking to start exchanging some pieces and to try to reduce the firepower that white has at his disposal here. Garry exchanges on c6, and after the recapture, he plays f4. Look at all these pawns just storming up the board. He hasn't even made that many piece moves. He's got his knight, his bishop, and his rook developed, but he's still a handful of moves away from completing his development, but he's not worried about that at this stage. He's just storming up the board. What is black going to do about this? How does he respond? b5. Black is looking to get his own action going down the queen side, and queen to f3 now. So finally starting to mobilize the full army. We have some x-ray pressure down here, and with the queen on f3, she's supporting a potential f5 break, and that queen can scoot across to various different positions to start attacking that black king. So the queen is very well placed on f3, and it is a very common square in the Sicilian for white to place that queen. We have bishop to b7 from black with pressure on the center and some x-rays against the white queen. Bishop to d3. So now have a look at the placement of the white bishops here. We've got glorious placement of all of the pieces. It seems like things are just ready to explode here for white, with the placement of these pieces in such an aggressive manner. And black plays knight to b4, attacking that dangerous looking bishop. it seems like a very natural approach here from black. That bishop on d3 looks incredibly dangerous. If white can manage to open up some lines, that piece could be very formidable. So he just looks to exchange off that very dangerous looking piece with knight to b4. Garry pushes forward with f5, so looking to open up some lines so that his pieces can start getting involved in the attack. Black takes the pawn, and Garry retakes with his queen. So have a look at this dangerous looking battery here. Black cannot tolerate that. He simply removes the bishop. Garry retakes, and he plays queen to c8. Eyeing that white queen that's dangerously placed on f5, asking if Garry is interested in an exchange of queens. Now obviously Garry wouldn't exchange like this, which would just bring one of the black rooks into a nice location, so we don't do that. Garry instead plays h6. Black absolutely cannot take that pawn, obviously because of the pressure along the g-file. So he needs to do something else. In the game, he plays rook to e8, centralizing that rook, and he's got some ideas actually with this rook move. But I just wanted to show an interesting defensive approach that the engine had actually. What the engine wanted to do was to push forward with g6 and close these two files, making it a lot more difficult for white to open up lines. In this position here, it turns out that white doesn't really have much better than to exchange the queens. Have a look at what happens if white tries to simply drop the queen back, keeping it in a seemingly active, aggressive position. Have a look at how quickly black can turn things around. Notice now, the white queen is lined up against this rook. Whenever you see these types of X-rays against pieces such as the king or the queen, you always need to think about, can we suddenly blast open that file and take advantage of this situation here? F5 is what the computer is screaming out for, and you really don't want to be taking en passant here, because when the bishop retakes, we've still got that X-ray. We're threatening to take c3 with check, which means you'd lose your queen. So actually black all of a sudden just completely springs to life in this situation, and it turns out that the opening of this F file here actually favors black and not white. So you really don't want to be taking en passant here. If white tries to take that pawn with his e pawn, well, we simply take it with the rook. We are now attacking the queen. Let's say the queen tries to stay within the vicinity of the black king and try to keep herself in a dangerous position. The black queen centralizes herself with pressure here, and this just looks absolutely incredible for black actually. So we can see how quickly things can turn around for black. And the main thing to remember from this pattern here is just whenever you see your rooks X-raying either the king or the queen, or potentially an unprotected piece, just think, are there ways that I can just suddenly blow open that file and take advantage of the fact that my rook is X-raying? Okay, so in the game we had rook to e8. So he's got an interesting tactical idea with this move of how to keep the game in balance. Garry takes the pawn on g7, and now we see black's tactical idea in defense. He exchanges queens, Garry retakes, and now we can see that the black rook is lined up against the king. Again, that same type of motive. Whenever we see our rook X-raying against something like the king or the queen or an unprotected piece, in this case it's both actually. We have the king and an unprotected piece. So we can see that there's a lot of tactical energy in the air at the moment. So black's idea was that he can simply now take that pawn on g5 because the bishop on e3 is hanging now. So Garry takes the bishop on g5, but black in exchange takes the bishop on e3 with check. So that was black's defensive idea. And just because the queens are off the board now, don't think that, hey, there are no more tactical, interesting possibilities in this game. This game gets incredibly tactical, even with the queens off the board. Garry steps out of check and attacks that rook. Rook to f3 with some potential activity down to f2, keeping an eye on this dangerous pawn as well. So a nice location for that rook. Now, of course, Kasparov being Kasparov is always going to be playing attacking moves. Knight to e4. And do you see the threat here? Hello, what's happening here? If that knight manages to get onto f6, that is actually a checkmate. So black has got no choice but to rip that knight off the board. And once again, don't fall asleep here, because this game has a lot of crazy, interesting tactical sequences that are coming up. You might not think that rook endgames like this are tactical in nature, but they are. And the main motive here is that this black king is really short on squares. He actually can't move anywhere at the moment. So black plays rook to e8 with pressure on this pawn. And now I know that a lot of club players would be tempted to play a passive defensive move like rook to e1, defending that pawn, or potentially dropping their rook back here to g4 to defend laterally. Garry Kasparov would never play a passive defensive move like that. Not a chance. He plays rook to c1. I'll give that move an exclamation mark. His idea is that black cannot take on e4 because he'd actually get back rank checkmated. So Garry is always playing these counter-attacking moves. He's not going to fall back into passive defensive moves. He's always attacking, always counter-attacking. So black cannot take this pawn. He instead pushes forward with d5, putting pressure on that pawn now. And Garry simply pushes the pawn forward. His pawns are now storming forward, and once again, the black rook can't take that pawn because the same issue happens on the back rank. Black instead tries playing h6, attacking the rook. And now in this position here, Garry played rook to h5, but have a look at what could have happened. There was an absolutely incredible potential sequence here, which could have happened with rook to h1, double exclamation mark. Can you see the idea here? If black takes the rook, we simply play f6, and there's no stopping this. The white rook is just crashing through and delivering checkmate. There's nothing that black can do other than just give material away. So an absolutely incredible potential shot that could have happened there with rook to h1 in this situation, completely ignoring that the rook was under attack. Okay, but Garry instead plays rook to h5, which is also a very strong move. In the game, black played rook takes e5, but can you see what would have happened if the king tried to take that pawn? Have a look at this. Rook to g1 check, forcing the king into the corner, and now we play e6, exclamation mark. If black takes that pawn, we simply slide up into g6, and now taking that pawn with checkmate is completely unstoppable. So the reason why e6 here was an exclamation mark move is it deflects the pawn on f7, which now frees up the g6 square. And with the g6 square freed up, we can slot in there with our rook, and taking on h6 with checkmate is unstoppable. So e6 in this variation, incredibly powerful, deflecting the f-pawn. But if we go back, black did not take that pawn on g7. Instead, he took the pawn on e5 instead. And now have a look at this brilliant move from Kasparov. Absolutely insane. He plays f6. Look at this. His rook is completely under attack now, which obviously can't be taken because if black tries to take the rook on h5, we come in here with check, the king is forced into the corner, and we create a queen with checkmate. So that rook absolutely cannot be taken. But not only can the rook not be taken, the fact that we have pushed forward with f6 means that we're now attacking your rook. We know that you can't take us, but hello, we're attacking you now. So you need to think about something that you're going to do about that, because your rook is now under attack. And we're also threatening to come back here, kick your king off the back rank, and to create a queen. So a huge amount of threats at the moment. Black tries giving a check. Garry steps up with his king, another check. He continues stepping up, and now he's just simply threatening to take the rook on e5. Black gives another check. We continue stepping forward. He has to return back to e8 to guard the back rank, otherwise the threats were just incredible. And now have a look at this. He simply takes the pawn on h6 with an incredibly devastating checkmate threat here. Is there anything that Black can do to delay or prevent this? He tries giving a check on f5, and Garry steps back to d4 with his king. The idea being that now when the next check comes on f4, he's stepping forward. And have a look at this position here. You might think that, hey, I'm winning a rook here. Well, Garry doesn't care about that rook because there's a checkmate in 1 being threatened here. You can take that rook if you want. It doesn't matter. So he realizes that he can't take that rook. He instead gives the check on e5. But now he simply steps up to b6. And the idea of this king march to the queen side was that he can now intercept and block the checks with his rook. And the final move in the game after rook to e6 check was rook to c6. And in this position, Polugaevsky resigned because there is an absolutely incredible threat of checkmate in 1 at the moment. If you think that you can take that pawn, well, actually you can't, because very typical tactical motif here. We don't take this rook here because then Black would just simply retake and he'll be fine. No, we take the rook on f6 and White is just up a rook and he'll be winning that endgame very, very easily. So there's nothing to be done here. Black resigned. So what an absolutely incredible game here from Kasparov. A very, very high energy pawn storm up the board, just really delaying his development and just storming forward with his pawns. And some absolutely incredible tactical sequences there in the rook endgame. Just keeping in mind from this video, if you want to play like Garry Kasparov, don't be playing quiet, passive defensive moves. When we go back to, where was it? This position here, where he plays rook to c1. This position here, really burn this into your memory. When you see something of yours being under attack, your first instinct doesn't necessarily have to be to play a passive defensive move. No, think about how you can get active yourself and counterattack and play like Garry Kasparov. Alright, well I hope that everyone enjoyed that game and thank you for watching.